Hey folks, Richard Ames here. I'm a composer who works primarily in music for the media, and I'd like to welcome you to my first ever vidcast. Now, bear with me as I venture into this new medium. I'm sure there will be some humps and bumps along the way. I'm a complete neophyte when it comes to producing vidcasts. However, I have spent a number of years building and optimizing computers for use as a digital audio workstation, or DAW. And I've spent a lot of time speaking with other composers about their DAWs, what hardware they use, what software they use, how they integrate the two, what sort of tweaks they make in the system in order to get the technology out of the way so that they can focus on the music. So what I'll show you in this video is an overview of the hardware and software that I use to produce the types of music that I write. Now, my primary musical palette is the virtual orchestra. So what you'll see in this video is the setup that I use to produce music for the virtual orchestra. There's lots of information out there on the web on processor speeds and disk read benchmarks and all sorts of other good information about how particular pieces of the computer work. But there's not a lot of good information out there on how you can assemble all of that and what it allows you to do in terms of writing for the virtual orchestra. How many string voices can I achieve? How many brass voices can I get? How many woodwind voices can I get? How many voices can I throw at the computer before it starts to beg for mercy and crackle and pop and produce all sorts of audio junk coming out of the monitors? So that's what I'll show you in this video, is not only the overview of the hardware and software setup that I use, but also musical examples of what you're able to achieve with that particular setup. Now, lest you think I am going to share with you the secret on how to become the next John Williams, I am not. This video is not really about the music. This video is about the technology that enables you to produce the music. So if you write bad music before watching this video, you will write bad music after watching this video. However, maybe you'll pick up a couple tips and tricks that enable you to write bad music more quickly. The computer hardware that I use includes a master DAW and two slaves, and the basic breakdown of computational labor in this setup is as follows. The master DAW keeps track of the score, so it knows which instrument is supposed to play which note at what time and what volume, all of those sorts of musical details. And it sends that information out to the two slaves that house the virtual musicians that respond to that music, process it, generate the appropriate audio on the appropriate instrument for the appropriate note for the appropriate duration, and send that audio back into the master DAW. So the master DAW not only keeps track of the score, but it also does all the processing on the audio streams coming from the virtual orchestra. So it applies things like equalization, reverb, and other audio effects to sell the illusion that this trio of computers is actually an entire orchestra playing the music contained on the master DAW. The master DAW that I use is an i7-920 overclocked to 3.8 gigahertz. The stock speed on this CPU is, I think, 2.6 gigahertz. It might be 2.8, I'm not sure. But overclocking is a pretty standard technique used by computer geeks to get more performance out of their processors. So there's a lot of good information on the web. If you want to know how to take your 2.6 gigahertz processor and make it run at 3.8 gigahertz, you can go out and figure out how to do that. It's free. It only takes a few minutes to do, so you might as well do it. For the true geeks out there, I'll also mention that I have the processor C-states disabled on my master DAW. I have SpeedStep enabled, but within the operating system, I set the minimum processor state at 100%. So it runs at 3.8 gigahertz 100% of the time and never downclocks to save power or energy. If you have a more recent processor, you can probably get by with allowing it to downclock to a lower clock speed and still be just fine. But this processor is several years old at this point. It needs all the help that it can get. There's 24 gigs of RAM on the master DAW. It's actually underclocked at 1140 megahertz. Now the RAM on the master DAW is rated at 1600 megahertz, but it's underclocked at 1140 because the combination of clock speeds and multipliers I had to use to get this 3.8 gigahertz on the processor gave me 1140 megahertz on the RAM. And there's lots of geeky details in there that you don't need to worry about. But suffice it to say that even though the RAM is rated at 1600 megahertz and I'm running it at only 1140, makes no no difference in the performance of the overall system. So there's lots of good information out there on the web that shows that RAM speed has very little effect on overall system performance for any meaningful metric. Sure, it'll get you higher readings on benchmarks, but in terms of actual practical application, it really doesn't matter. So don't spend a lot of money on high speed RAM unless you just like wasting cash. It's not going to buy you anything in terms of any meaningful performance. The operating system on the Master DAW is Windows 7. I run it off a 128 gigabyte Crucial solid state drive. If you don't know what a solid state drive is, that's the newer version of the hard disk drive. It's got faster read speeds, it's got lower seek time. So, overall, much better technology. It makes your system much snappier in a number of different ways. And then there's a mix of solid state drives and HDDs, hard disk drives for the other drives. And I've got two SATA 3 PCI interfaces for the solid state drives. Now, when you're running the solid state drives, you want to make sure you run them off of a SATA 3 interface and not a SATA 2 interface. SATA 2 is the older technology, and it's not fast enough to really take advantage of all of the bandwidth that you can get out of a solid state drive. So whatever you run your solid state drives on, make sure it's a SATA 3 interface. The reason I had to add a PCI interface is because my motherboard and processor are so old that they don't support SATA 3 natively. Most computers purchased new within the last few years already support SATA 3 natively on the motherboard. Mine is 5 years old, so it doesn't do that. So check on your system specs first. You might already have SATA 3 as standard on your system. And then my audio interface is an RME Fireface 800. It's connected via FireWire 400. So even though the interface will support up to FireWire 800, I'm only using a FireWire 400 connection for it. The first slave is an i5 2500K that's overclocked to 4.4 gigahertz. And unlike the Master DAW, I leave the C states enabled on the slave machines. I found that I needed to disable the C states on the Master DAW to get the latencies down, but the slaves were good enough with them enabled, so I just left them on to give myself the advantage of the savings in power and heat. It's got 32 gigs of RAM at 1600 megahertz, and I run the Windows 7 operating system on my slave off of a hard disk drive. There's no reason to run the slave operating system off of a solid state drive. It doesn't buy you much because all that the slave does is boot up and then sit there and wait for MIDI data from the Master DAW to send back audio data. So unless you're really concerned about boot times for your slaves, I'd just run the operating system off of a hard disk. There's no reason to spend money on a solid state drive for the slave. It won't buy you anything. And then there's a combination of OCZ and Crucial solid state drives for the sample libraries on the slave. You definitely want to make sure that you run your sample libraries off of solid state drives. And the reason is that the sample libraries require quick access to the audio data in order to respond to the MIDI data and generate the audio data that goes back to the Master DAW. So you want very high read speeds, you want very low latencies for your sample libraries. So don't waste the SSDs on the operating system, put them to work for the sample libraries. That's where you really see the most bang for your buck. And then the second slave is essentially an identical copy of the first. i5 2500K, 32 gigs of RAM, it runs Windows 7 off of HDD, and it's got a mix of OCZ and Crucial solid state drives. An important part of this setup is that there is no audio hardware on the slaves. All of this transfer of MIDI and audio happens over Ethernet. There's a lot of debate among composers about whether it's better to use dedicated audio hardware on the slaves or to just run everything over the network. The standard argument is that dedicated hardware on the slaves will get you lower overall system latency. In other words, the system will be more responsive if you run dedicated audio hardware on the slaves. However, my experience was exactly the opposite. When I took the audio hardware out of my slaves and started running MIDI and audio over Ethernet, my total system latency actually decreased quite significantly. So my experience was opposite of what the standard statement is regarding audio hardware on the slaves. Plus, it costs a lot of money to put audio hardware on the slaves, and you've got Ethernet already installed. So if you've got a couple of slave computers, you can use the Ethernet that's already installed on them to send the MIDI and audio back and forth. There's no reason to spend extra money on audio hardware. And then another big advantage of the Ethernet connection is that it's much more flexible. You can get hundreds of audio channels over Ethernet back into the Master DAW. That's very difficult to do with audio hardware without spending many, many thousands of dollars. So from the standpoint of both performance and flexibility, I've got to say the Ethernet option is much better than the dedicated audio hardware option. An obvious question when looking at this three computer setup is, do I really need three computers? Can I just combine all three into one very powerful computer that does the same thing? And the shorter answer is it depends. It depends on four primary factors, the first of which is the amount of RAM that you need. My standard orchestral template, in other words, the standard collection of instruments that I load up, requires about 55 gigabytes of RAM. The limit on what you can get on a single machine these days is 64 gigabytes. So if my 55 gigabytes of virtual instruments is added to, say, another 5 gigabytes of the operating system and sequencer and various other things, you start to bump up against that 64 gigabyte limit pretty quickly. So if you've got more than 64 gigabytes, obviously that drives you towards a multi-computer setup. But even if you're using only 55 or 60 gigabytes for your orchestral template, there's not a lot of margin there, and you'll probably run into some issues at some point if you really push the limits of a single machine. So the first issue is RAM. If you need a lot of RAM, you probably should go with a master plus slave setup. The other issue is system latency. And what is latency? Well, latency is the time it takes for the computer to respond to the input that you give it. So if you hit a note on your keyboard, the computer has to take that input, process it, and generate the audio associated with the input that you gave it. That takes time, and that time lag is called latency. If you have a system with very high latency, then when you hit a note on your keyboard, it takes a very long time for the sound to come out of the monitors. And that can be very annoying, particularly for instruments such as piano, harp, guitar, percussion, anything that has a very fast attack time. It can start to feel very unnatural if you have a very high system latency. With the master plus slave setup, you have three separate data paths to the processor versus only one data path to the processor on a single machine setup. We call that data path a bus. And if you're trying to cram all of the information from all of your virtual instruments onto a single bus, it can get clogged up and slow down, and that will increase your system latency if you're running a single machine. If you're running multiple machines, though, you've got multiple buses. In other words, multiple data paths for the processor to interact with the RAM and the disk and process all of the information to generate the audio from the virtual instruments. So it stands to reason that a master plus slave setup will have lower overall system latency than a single machine by itself. Another important consideration is cost. The hardware that I showed you is about $2,500. The i7-920 Master and then the i5-2500K slaves, you can buy all of that hardware for $2,500, maybe $3,000. So the question is, can I get a single machine that will give me the same amount of RAM and the same system latency for that $2,500? And the answer is, I don't know, but I don't think so because I haven't seen it demonstrated anywhere. So from the standpoint of cost, if you've got $2,500 to spend, you're probably better off buying a master plus slave setup with older technology than a single machine setup with newer technology. And then the final consideration is reliability. If you have three computers running your virtual orchestra and one goes down, it's much easier to redistribute the workload so that you can still get some work done on the other two. If you have only one machine and you lose an operating system drive, you're down until you can get that replaced. You can't meet deadlines, you can't write any music, you can't do anything until you get that fixed. So from the standpoint of RAM, latency, cost, and reliability, it seems to me that the most logical choice is still the master plus slave setup. However, I remain hopeful that at some point in the near future, we will be able to replace all of these machines with a single one that gives us the same amount of RAM, perhaps more, at the same system latency, for the same cost and reliability. However, in my opinion, we're not quite there just yet. Here we are in the sequencer on the master DAW, and this is the standard template that I use for my orchestral tracks. The sequencer that I use is Cubase version 6.0, and if you don't know what a sequencer is, basically each of these tracks represents an instrument or group of instruments, and these blocks of data contain the notes. So all of these blocks of data here are sort of the score in computer form. All of the MIDI data represent the notes, the durations, the volumes, all of that sort of musical information that gets sent out to the slaves. And in my standard template, I like to put the synthesizers, sound design effects, other non-orchestral elements up at the top. And then below that, in roughly score order, are the instruments of the virtual orchestra. So here at the top is the chorus. Let me open up this folder to show you what I've got going on in here. So here are the sopranos, altos, tenors, basses, boys, and chorus effects. And I have control over each of those individual channels. But I like to put them in these folder tracks so that I can zip them up into a nice compact form and make the score easier to read if I'm not working on those particular tracks. So it sort of hides them, but still lets you know that there's data there that you can open up and dig into. So below the chorus, follow the strings and then the woodwinds, the brass, the keyboards, guitar and harp, a whole bunch of drums, and then a couple of orchestral effects libraries. So let's open up the LA scoring strings section here, and let me show you a couple of things. First of all, one of the really great things about Cubase are these expression maps. So for example, on violin 1, there are several different playing styles that I can choose from: staccato, tremolo, legato, spiccato, sordino, etc. And the expression maps allow you to combine all of these different playing styles onto a single track. Back in the day, before we had expression maps, you would need to use a separate track for each one of these articulations or playing styles. So you could see, instead of this one track, I would have this 8 or 10 tracks, and then combine that, multiply that across violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, double bass, and you go from 5 tracks here into a heck of a lot more very quickly. So the ability to combine all of these different articulations and playing styles onto a single track is an extremely handy feature. It makes the score much easier to read. It makes it appear much more like a traditional score. Now, it's certainly true that there are other methods for dealing with multiple playing styles, multiple articulations per instrument. For example, you could use MIDI controller data, you could use MIDI key switches, but none of those is particularly musically intuitive. And that's the nice thing about the expression maps, is that they relate to the changes in articulations and playing styles in a musical way and not in a technical way. So if you get a chance to use something like expression maps in whatever sequencer you use, I strongly recommend it. It really helps you to sort of push the technology out of the way and focus on the music. So that's an overview of the standard score layout that I use for my orchestral writing. But these are just the notes, right? As I mentioned earlier, the virtual musicians reside on the 2 slave machines. So all these notes are sitting here on the master DAW. They need to be sent out to the virtual musicians on the 2 slave machines. And the way I do that is through software called Vienna Ensemble Pro. Each of these tracks is assigned to an output on Vienna Ensemble Pro in the VST instrument rack here. So what Vienna Ensemble Pro does is it takes the notes and connects them with one of the slave machines. I have 2 slaves, one called Fogey, one called Farley. This is the IP address for that one. So this is the chorus. I use Voxos for my chorus. So all of the Voxos channels here in the project window gets sent to this instance of Vienna Ensemble Pro, which in turn sends the musical information over Ethernet to the Fogey slave machine, specifically to the Voxos channels on the Fogey slave machine. They process that musical data and send the audio back into the DAW, and I'll explain exactly how that works in just a minute. Let's hop over to the slave machine and see what's going on there. So I've connected to the slave machine via Windows Remote Desktop, and this is it. This is everything that's on that slave machine. This is the Vienna Ensemble Pro server. So this piece of software essentially coordinates the activities of all of the virtual musicians located on this slave machine. And this is my strings and brass slave. So you see all these libraries are strings and brass. So let's open up this Vienna Symphonic Library strings and brass player here and take a look at it. So over here on the left, each of these channels corresponds to one of the channels in the template that I showed you. So here's the violin 1, 1B, 1C, 2, 2B, 2C. So these channels receive the MIDI data from the master DAW. And within this Vienna Instruments Pro player, they generate the required audio and send it back out to the master DAW. So here's another view of it. This is the mixer view that shows all of the individual channels and the levels. And if the music were playing, you would see the levels on here of the audio being sent back into the master DAW. So again, here you see violin 1, 1B, 1C, 2, 2B, 2C, and this is strings and brass. So we've got some trumpets, some horns, flugelhorn, trombones down here. So, what this represents is all of the audio that's being sent over Ethernet back into the master DAW. Now, traditionally, this has been done with audio hardware and not with Ethernet. So, if I were using audio hardware, I would be limited to probably only 8 of these. I would have to combine a number of instruments onto one channel. But because I'm going over Ethernet, I can have individual channels for each of the individual instruments. So that allows me a lot of flexibility. And if you notice, all of the panning, the insert effects, things like equalization, reverb, all of those sorts of things, I do none of that on the slave because I'm able to send all of the pristine audio channels back into the master DAW and do it all in one spot there without having to mess with the slave. So that allows me to run my slaves in a standard setup that I boot up every time and that never changes. So within the master DAW, I can save all of the changes to things like panning, equalization, reverb, all of those sorts of things, and I don't have to do it on the slave. So that's really tough to do if you use audio hardware. But if you use the Ethernet hardware and allow yourself all of these channels coming back from the slave, it makes for a much more flexible configuration. And I strongly recommend you consider the Ethernet route for that reason. Let's jump back into the sequencer on the master DAW and take a look at how it handles all of those audio tracks coming back from the two slave machines. So to do that, let me open up the mixer window. So this mixer window shows you all of the audio returns coming into the master DAW from the slave machines. The exception are these first 3 tracks right here, the synthesizers and the sound design effects. Those are local on the master DAW. But starting with the sopranos and further to the right, those are all the channels coming into the DAW from the slave machines. So here's the chorus. Beyond them are the strings. Then you pick up the brass. Beyond that, we have woodwinds, some percussion. And then down at the end, we've got harp, piano, guitar, orchestral effects, and then a collection of reverb channels. Now, as I mentioned, one of the advantages of the Ethernet setup is that you're able to pull all of these tracks back into the master DAW. If I were using audio hardware, I'd probably have to combine all of the chorus into one stereo return coming back into the master DAW because I just don't have enough channels over audio hardware to have all of these separate channels coming back from the slave machines. And what that allows me to do is store these audio processing effects in the project on the master DAW. So, for example, these are equalizers up here on this top row. These are stereo images on the second row. And I can apply these individually on a per channel basis because I've got individual channels coming back from the slave machines. Now, it's true that you can do all of this on the slave and just send the mix down back into the master DAW, but that's a little bit more cumbersome workflow for at least 3 reasons. First, if you keep the channel settings on the slave, then obviously that requires that you connect to the slave in order to make any changes. So to do that, you have to leave the sequencer, go to a remote desktop connection, make the changes that you want, then go back to the sequencer, start the playback again. So there's a little bit of a hassle factor there that you can avoid if you just run all of the audio channels into the sequencer and make the changes from within the sequencer. Second, if you keep the track information on the slaves, then that requires that you run VE Pro in what's called coupled mode. And that requires the sequencer to store a lot more information in the project file. So your project files will become much larger, your save times will take much longer. And if you try to do, for example, an auto save every 5 minutes, you're going to be stuck waiting while that giant file saves all of the information that it's writing for the slave machines. It's much more efficient if you save that information in the DAW's native mixer rather than on the slaves. Finally, if you keep all of the track information stored in the project on the master DAW, then the slaves are completely independent of whatever project you're working on at any given time. So you can swap projects to your heart's content and the slaves will never change. You never have to worry about whether a particular insert is on a particular channel or not. It doesn't matter. It's always the same, and all of the changes that you make are stored in the sequencer on the master DAW. I'm going to use the end of this track to show how this system responds to what I consider a full orchestration. It's a good track to use because it's got a build starting right here at this bar 113 towards the end. Starts off with just a couple of strings, picks up some woodwinds, there's some synthesizers in there, picks up some percussion, and finally ends with a tutti section where the strings, the woodwinds, the brass, the percussion, the synthesizers, everything is going all at once. So it gives you a good idea of that progression from sort of low intensity up to high intensity in terms of number of required voices. So the primary strings in this particular track are LA scoring strings. Again, we start off with just a couple of violins and then pick up the full section later on. Likewise with the woodwinds, starts off with just piccolo and flute in a couple of spots. And then towards the end, we get to a tutti woodwind section where we've got piccolo, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon. Same thing with the brass. I'm using cinebrass here, so towards the end, they all come in. We've got trumpets, horns, trombones, and then the low brass patch. And then I'm also layering in some east-west brass just at a lower level on top of the cinebrass just to fill out the sound a little bit. Likewise, I'm layering in a little bit of the Vienna dimension strings on top of the LA scoring strings here at the end, just to add a little bit of bite to the notes there at the end. So this is what I consider a full orchestration here at the end of this track. And it gives you an idea of how the system responds to that full orchestration. Before I start playback and take a look at system performance, let me address one other piece of the setup that is very, very important, and that is the audio buffer size. When the sequencer sends audio data to the sound card, it does so in chunks of data at a time. In other words, it doesn't just send one bit of data and then another bit of data and then another. It bundles up all of those bits into a chunk and sends the chunk all at once. The size of that chunk is called the buffer size. Most sound cards will give you a range of options for the buffer size. This one goes from 48 samples at the low end to 1024 at the high end. So which should you choose? Well, it turns out that the transfers are much more efficient for larger buffer sizes. So the system won't have to work as hard if you pick a very large buffer size. However, you can't do anything else with the sound card while each transfer is occurring. So the larger the sample size you pick, the more time it takes before the sound card can respond to any changes that you make. So if you hit a key on the keyboard, the sound card can't respond to that input until the next chunk of data is received. So the larger that chunk of data, the longer the time it takes for the sound card to respond to your inputs. So why not just make it as small as possible? Well, the sample transfer is much more efficient for very large chunk sizes and very inefficient for very small chunk sizes. So the system has to work a lot harder for very small buffer sizes. And that could mean that you run into issues like dropouts, clicks, and pops, and those sorts of things if your buffer size gets below what your system can handle. So as a practical matter, what you need to do is find the buffer size that balances the overall system latency with the overall processor performance. So on my system, that happens to be at about 128 samples. In other words, I can run at 128 samples without getting any clicks and pops or other types of audio artifacts. So that's as low as I can go before starting to get those sorts of problems. If I could go lower, I would, but I can't. 128 samples is the limit for my system. Now, another important thing to consider when you're using software like Vienna Ensemble Pro is that it requires time to transfer data back and forth between the slaves. So it needs time to send data over the network, get the slaves to respond, and return the data back to the master DAW. So it incurs an additional latency on top of what the sound card latency requires. And I've got it set right now to 1 buffer. You can change it to 2 buffers, and you can even set it to 0 buffers if you want to. So if you add the 128 samples for my sound card buffer to the additional 128 samples for this VE Pro instance, you see that my master plus slave setup has a total buffer size of 256 samples, which turns out to be about 6 milliseconds for this setup. Okay, so let's take a look at how this system performs as we play back this track. What you see here are the CPU usage meters for the 2 slaves up here at the top and the master DAW down at the bottom. The master DAW is a 4-core processor with 2 threads per core, so there are a total of 8 threads available. And then the slaves are 4-core processors with 1 thread per core, so there are 4 threads available on each of the slaves. Now, the first thing you notice is that this slave is running idle at about 10-15%, and this slave is running idle at 40%, 45%. The reason is that this slave uses the East-West Play library, which requires a lot more processing power. This one uses the Vienna Symphonic Library and the Contact libraries that require significantly less processing power. So that's the big difference between those two slaves right there. And then the master DAW is running at around 27, 28, maybe 35%. Normally it runs at around 20%, but keep in mind, while I'm recording this screen capture, I've got background audio recording going on to capture the audio for it. And then, of course, I'm doing the screen capture itself. So all of the processing work that's going on right now is significantly more than what I normally do in a standard setup, because I don't just record vidcasts all the time. Most of the time, I'm just working on music. So that's an important consideration to think about. Normally, the CPU usage on the master DAW is down around 20% or so. So these three boxes here show you the processor usage. This box, the VST performance meter, shows you the audio card usage. So these three boxes show you how hard the CPU or the processor is working, and this box shows you how hard the sound card is working. And they're not necessarily related. People get confused by that. They start to get pops and crackles in their audio, and this meter starts spiking. It'll turn red when you get pops and crackles. But the CPU usage is 10% or 15%. And they say, well, geez, my CPU usage is so low. Why am I getting crackles and pops? They're not necessarily related. The VST performance has more to do with the overall real-time efficiency of your system. In other words, how well the things like the video card, the audio card, the network card work in real time versus what their raw processing power is. And I'm going to have another video on that coming up at some point in the future to help explain why that is. So let's go ahead and start playback here and see what we get. So as you remember at the start here, there are just a couple of strings, there's a piano, so the CPU usage is relatively low, not that far from idle. It's basically about the same. Now we pick up the flute here on one of the slaves, still not much difference. Now we've picked up some of the synth elements, a few more string instruments, so our CPU usage is rising a little bit. We've added a few more instruments. Again, we've gone up just a bit more. Now we get to the last section where the entire orchestra is playing all at once, the different libraries across all the different instruments. So now you can see CPU usage on this slave is over 50%, approaching 60% sometimes, 30 to 40% on this slave, and the master DAW is up around sometimes as high as 40%, and ASIO usage, VST performance, also is spiking significantly higher as we get towards that end 2D section. Now let me show you the difference between CPU performance and sound card performance, or ASIO performance. By the way, ASIO stands for Audio Stream Input Output. It's the standard that the sequencer uses to transfer data to and from the sound card. So in order to show that difference, let me pull up the mixer window here. So what I'll do is I'll start the playback, and you'll hear it as you did before. You'll see the VST performance and the CPU performance is about the same. And then what I'll do is I'll turn on this mastering processor. And this mastering processor is one that is an ASIO hog. In other words, it uses a lot of sound card processing power. So what you'll see is even though the CPU usage doesn't change very much, you'll start to hear a lot of clicks and pops, and you'll see this orange light start to show up. So let me go ahead and start playback. So here we have around 30 to 40% ASIO usage with similar sorts of levels for the CPU. Now I'm going to come over here and turn on this processor right now. And immediately you hear the clicks and pops that emerge, and you see this orange light turn on here. And the ASIO usage is spiking, the average is significantly higher than it was before, but the CPU usage is not that much higher, maybe only 4 or 5%. So that shows you that even though you're not taxing the CPU that much, you are taxing the audio system significantly with this particular plugin. So it shows the difference between VST performance and CPU performance. So there are plenty of situations where you're just fine on CPU performance, but you run into problems with a particular plugin, or you have problems with something like a video driver or a network driver that's causing the transfers to the audio card to be delayed and give you those clicks and pops. Now let's do the same test, but with the buffer size set to a much higher latency. So this is a much larger buffer. If you remember previously I was running at 128, so now I'm running at 1024, the biggest possible buffer on this sound card. And as I mentioned, the larger buffer sizes are much more efficient. So you're able to get away with a lot more processing with a larger buffer size than you can with a smaller buffer size. So let's go ahead and start the playback again. You notice right away too, just at idle, the VST performance is significantly lower. CPU usage, not so much, maybe 5-6% lower, but not really a significant hit. So let's go ahead and start the playback again. See the VST performance comes up just a little bit. CPU usage comes up just a little bit. And then let's turn on this mastering processor again. This time, the ASIO usage went up, but I'm not getting the crackles and the pops, and I'm not getting the overloads. The reason, again, is that I've increased this buffer size so that the overall efficiency of the audio system is increased, and I can deal with the higher levels of processing that are required from this particular plugin. The final question I'd like to answer in this video is, how many voices can you throw at the slave before it begins to beg for mercy? I've shown you an example of a mastering processor that forces the system to beg for mercy, but how many voices can I throw at those slave machines before they become overwhelmed and just produce crackles and pops and can't keep up with the requests for the new notes? So to answer that question, I've created this bogus project, and let me open up the VSL woodwinds here and show you what I've got. So here are the woodwinds: piccolo, flute, oboe, on down through the section, and each of these instruments is assigned an ascending and descending major scale in 16th notes at 160 beats per minute. It modulates at the start of each measure here. So after each descent, it goes into a new key. And the reason I do that is that if I kept going up and down the same scale over and over, it becomes easier for the computer to handle with that, because all of the notes are called from the most recent memory that the computer has used, the cache memory, and it makes it easier for it to do that. So modulating at each measure is a little bit harder. So to do the stress test, we want to make it as hard as possible. So these run up and down the major scales and modulate at the start of each measure. So that's the piccolo there, and then all of the instruments have exactly the same setup: the flute, the clarinets, the bassoons, and of course they're in registers appropriate for each instrument. So let's do this. Let's first of all solo the piccolo, and let's play it and see what we get. So there's the piccolo going up and down that scale. Let me hop over to the slave machine and show you what's going on. So here's the piccolo channel. You can see the audio is being played. It goes back and starts over. Here's the CPU usage while that's going on. And here's the voice count. So you see, one instrument is not equal to one voice. In this case, one instrument is equal to 100 and something voices. And that's because it takes many voices to make the instrument sound realistic. So one instrument is not equal to one voice. So let's go back over to the master DAW and start adding some instruments. So let's add a couple of flutes. Flute section, alto flute, a couple of oboes. Let's go back over to the slave and take a look again. So now here you see piccolo, flute, flute section, alto flute, oboes. Now your voice count's up to 700-800. CPU usage is up quite a bit too. So we were at only 20-25% before. Now we're up to close to 40% at times. Let's go back, add a few more voices. Let's add the oboe section, English horn, and a couple clarinets. Go look back at the slave machine. So here you see all of those audio channels active down through the second clarinet here. And we're getting 1,300, looks like it's peaking around 1,400 voices here. Let's keep pushing it. Go back to the master DAW. Let's turn on the clarinet section and the E-flat clarinet. And up. There we go. Now we're starting to get clicks and pops. So somewhere around here, let's turn the E-flat clarinet off. So the clarinet section track right here is sort of marginal. Let's hop over to the slave and see what's going on. Let's pull down. So there's that piccolo all the way down through the clarinet section. And then you see we're getting 1,400, 1,500 voices or so. So when I added that E-flat clarinet, which is turned off right now, it put it over the edge. So the limit for this slave appears to be something like 1,500 voices, somewhere in this range of 1,400, 1,500 voices. So that means that I can get as many as 1,500 voices across the entire orchestra before I start to get clicks and pops from that slave. So that's what you can get in terms of voice counts from the Vienna Symphonic Library woodwinds. And I'll tell you, that's pretty representative of what you can get from their other libraries as well, because they all use the same sample player. They all use the VI Pro player. And it's really the player that dictates what sort of voice count you can get from any given hardware. So let's look at a library that uses a different player. So let me close down this group, mute the woodwinds. And I'll open up the LA scoring strings. The LA scoring strings are a contact-based library. So contact is a different sample player. And I had to treat these a little bit differently because I've only got 5 tracks here. So I had to put more notes on each track. So instead of just duplicates at the octave, I've got the root, the fifth, the octave, and then the fifth above that. So there are more notes per track to get the voice count up and make it comparable to what we had before. So let's do like we did before. We'll start off with just the first violin and let it play. Let me pull up my ASIO usage here. So here's my VST performance, still sitting around 25% or so. Let's go over to the slave machine and take a look. Here's that violin one that's playing right now. CPU usage is around 23, 25, 30%. And here are all of the violins that are part of that. And you see the voice count is up around 250, 260 voices maximum. Now the reason that is that the LA Scoring Strings violin is actually 4 separate violin recordings. There's a first chair, an A group, a B group, and a C group. So this track for violin 1 is actually 4 separate recordings. So let's go back into the master DAW and turn on some more tracks. We've got the second violins playing now. Let's add the violas. Cellos. All still seems to be well. Let me pull up my performance meter again. Let's add the double bass. Now we're starting to pick up some pops. And you can see the VST performance meter is signaling that it's getting overloaded. So let's go back into the slave machine here and take a look. So again, I've got 250, 260 coming out of the first track, around 250 coming out of the second one, similar sorts of numbers for all of them. So that's saying that somewhere between 1,000 and 1,250 is where this slave starts to break down for the contact player, which is pretty similar to what we got for the VI Pro player. If you remember, it was about 1,300, 1,400 voices was where it started to have issues. So that's nice that we've got confirmation that 2 different players are giving us about the same number of voices from this slave machine. And finally, let's take a look at the brass libraries and see what they give us in terms of number of voices. As I mentioned earlier, the East-West brass library that I use is relatively CPU intensive, and you can show that in this manner. Let's go over to the slave that houses that library and take a look. So as we showed earlier, the idle CPU usage on this slave with the East-West library is 40, 45% versus, say, 15% on the other slave that did not have the East-West library. And you can prove that it's the East-West library by coming back into the DAW, opening up your instrument rack. Let's go to the VE Pro instance that is connected to the East-West brass library, and let's disconnect it. So we'll give it a minute to disconnect. And now that it's no longer connected, let's go back over to that slave and take a look. You can see now that the CPU usage is way down, where it was around 45% previously. Now it's hovering 10 to 12%, something like that. So significantly reduced. So let's take a look then at what we can get out of the Cinebrass library with the East-West library disconnected so as not to skew the results. So let me go ahead and mute the East-West brass library. And then the Cinebrass I have set up essentially the same. So major scales up and down, modulating at the start of each measure. And I've only got one set of notes per track this time. So that's a difference from what we've had before. So let's start with the trumpets and get them playing. Jump over to the slave and take a look. So CPU usage not really doing much. Here's the trumpets that are playing right now. You see the audio return there. And we're getting maximum of maybe 70 voices or so. Let's go back, add a few more instruments. Let's add in all the horns. Let me pull up my VST performance to see if we've got any overloads. I'm not hearing any. I'm not seeing any, so we're all good. Oh, there was one little one. But basically pretty good so far. CPU usage is up to around 50%. I'm getting about 70 voices out of this track. About 140 out of this one. Around 80 out of this one. Max of 80 or 90 out of that one. Maxing about 80 on this one. And about 80 on this one as well. So let's add in the trombones here. Solo trombone. Now I'm starting to hear some more regular pops. And then let's finish off with tuba and bass trombone. Again, definitely getting more pops now. They're not very audible, so they're not too bad, but certainly you can see the overloads on the VST meter right here. And then let's add the last two lower voices. And clearly more clicks and pops at this point. So we've exceeded the capability of what that sample library can do. Now these are broken across two different instances of Vienna Ensemble, so I can't show them all on one, but suffice it to say that when you add all these up, you come up with around 500 or 600 voices that this particular library can support on the Contact player. So that shows you that the library makes a difference, whereas with the LA Scoring Strings library, which played on Contact, I could get 1,250 voices out of it. I can only get about half of that with this particular library. And the reason is that there's scripting associated with each library that they use to make the instruments play. And the scripting for some libraries is just more efficient than others. So the number of voices you can get will depend on what the particular library is. I've now reconnected the East-West brass library, so let's take a look at what we can get from it in terms of number of streaming voices. Keeping in mind that this is a different sample player. We've looked at the VSL sample player, we've looked at the Contact sample player. Now this is the Play sample player from East-West. So it's reconnected. Let's start off again with our trumpet here. And again, this is one line per voice, so I don't have the multi-lines per voice like I did for the strings and the woodwinds. Hop over to the slave and take a look. So here we are inside the Play player. We see our two trumpets line delivering audio back to the master DAW. CPU usage, not much changed from idle, a couple percent maybe. And I'm getting somewhere around 30 voices max or so. Let's go add a couple more. So let's add the horns. Let's add the trombones. Hop back over to the slave and take a look. So now I've got the trumpets at about 30 voices. The two horns are maxing out around 50 voices. The trombones are maxing out around 40 voices. Let's go back and add the tuba. And that's the breaking point. You can hear the couple of clicks and pops, and you can also see on the performance meter here, when I added in the tuba, that's where I started to get the clicks and pops. So the tuba added about another 40 voices or so. So that's a total of only about 160 voices out of the play sample player before I start to get clicks and pops. So obviously the library and the player itself make a big difference to the total number of voices that you can get. And we've showed that, with the VSL player, you're getting 1,300, 1,400. With the contact player, you're getting around 1,250 to 1,500 with the LA scoring strings library. The same contact player with the Cinebrass library, you're getting maybe around 500, 600. And then the play sample player with the East-West Brass library, you're getting only about 150, 160 voices. So from all that, you realize that the choice of sample library and sample player really does make a big difference in terms of what you can get for number of streaming voices off of any particular hardware. However, having said that, to be perfectly honest, if you look at this woodwind setup here again, this is absurd. There's nobody who would ever write anything like this, right? So maybe if you're sequencing Flight of the Bumblebee, you'll approach something that's kind of like that. But the truth is, as a practical matter, it really doesn't make any difference. And all of the libraries are perfectly sufficient for doing any type of orchestral mock-up that you might want to do. So there you go. Thanks for watching my first ever vidcast. I tried to strike a balance between detailed technical information on the one hand for all the hardcore music geeks out there, and more general information on the other hand for people who are just starting out, maybe people who know a little bit about music technology but aren't sure how the master plus slave setup works in terms of producing music for the virtual orchestra, and then people who are just curious about music technology, people who are interested in knowing how modern composers, particularly modern media composers, use computers to produce music for the virtual orchestra. As I promised at the start, there would be humps and bumps along the way, and there were, most notably the fact that all of the musical examples were in mono and not stereo. I don't normally write in mono. That was a screw up in setting up the audio tracks when I started the vidcast. So it will be fixed in future videos. Which brings me to my final point. I do intend to do more of these videos on how technology and music interact. So if you've got ideas on topics you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments below and I'll see if I can put together a video on it. In the meantime, you can find me on Facebook at Richard Ames Music or on my website at rgamesmusic.com. Thanks for watching.